Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of Israel, it's an honor for me to speak here today and share about my decade-long research on the 33rd US President Harry S. Truman. Much of my findings were documented in my book, The Miracle of Israel and President Truman, which was published in 2018. And today I try to summarize certain key events and actions of President Truman related to the political process that preceded the UN Resolution 181, exactly 75 years ago today. I want to present you the political situation of the world at that time, and even before we came into a moment of this event at the United Nations. So you can see green is positive approach for the Jewish people. Red is negative, and as we understand that black is really hostile and deadly. So that was the situation how the Zionism developed since 1850, around that time. And when we come to the year 1945, which was the end of the Second World War, we can see that there were some changes in leadership in the United States, in Great Britain, and of course in Germany. And what we can see that while President Roosevelt was successful in leading the war, so basically he didn't pay that much attention to saving the Jews. His idea to save the Jews was saving the Jews through victory. So first winning the war, and then the Jews would be saved. Unfortunately, that strategy didn't work. Suddenly, there was a new man coming on his way to White House that hardly anybody knew. That was Harry S. Truman, who started a local politician in Kansas City, Missouri, and through different phases of his career, he ended up in the White House. But that route was not that easy. As I study Harry Truman papers, I found a very interesting diary. So he wrote it down every June, the day 28th of June, starting from 1920. And you can see here different situations in his life. In 1920, he had returned from the World War I, and he had a happy year. Next year was still going very well. And then he was broke, and in a bad way. He made bankruptcy with his clothing shop for men. And somebody came to him and said that as you have now failed in business, why don't you try politics? And he did. And from that point on, so there were new positions in local politics. And then actually Roosevelt named him an employment director for the state of Missouri in 1933. And already next year he was running for the Senate. And so that was the rise of Harry Truman into a national level of politics in the United States. Roosevelt and Harry Truman was photographed only a very few times. And Harry Truman ran for vice presidency, and he won the primaries, and Roosevelt was running for his fourth term, and basically they started their term in January 20th, 1945. In just 82 days, Roosevelt suddenly dies. And Harry Truman, who never thought he wanted to become president, finds himself in the Oval Office. And that was a shock, not only for the Americans, but for Harry Truman, because he really didn't want to become president. A funny thing, not that funny, but a bit strange thing was that while he was vice president, during those 82 days, Harry Truman and President Roosevelt met only twice in official matters. And Harry Truman was outside everything important in the White House and the US administration. And when Harry Truman finds himself in the Oval Office, so there are piles of papers, memoranda, and correspondence and briefings, so he's about to die under that material. But so he finds Roosevelt's legacy related to Israel a bit disturbing. So he understood that Roosevelt and the State Department had given pledges and promises, especially for Saudi Arabia, in order to guarantee the availability of oil, which has been a critical element in the Second World War. Also, Harry Truman finds that Roosevelt had given very controversial promises both to Jews and Arabs, and also to the King Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia, related to the future of Palestine. And actually, President Truman finds out that his predecessor, already 2 years ago, in 1933, in Bermuda, he had agreed with the British Prime Minister Churchill on the restriction of the Jewish immigration to Palestine. And when Harry Truman learns about these things, he also finds a letter from President Roosevelt to King Saud in April 5, 1945, just 1 week before President Roosevelt dies. And the promise of President Roosevelt was the following: Your Majesty will recall that on previous occasions I communicated to you the attitude of the American government toward Palestine and made clear our desire that no decision be taken with respect to the basic situation in that country without full consultation with both Arabs and Jews. I would take no action in my capacity as chief of the executive branch of this government which might prove hostile to the Arab people. So a promise to discuss the things with both Arabs and Jews may sound balanced, but of course everybody knew in the government that it wasn't balanced. The Saudi position about the Jewish people at that time was the following, quoting King Ibn Saud: If America should choose in favor of the Jews who are accursed in the Quran as enemies of the Muslims until the end of the world, it will indicate to us that America has repudiated her friendship with us. Very clear. Truman writes back, "I am at a loss to understand why Your Majesty seems to feel that this statement was in contradiction to previous promises of statements made by this government." And until that moment, Truman many times, loudly, publicly, had said that we need to open Palestine for the Jewish refugees from the death camps. And that reaction from King Saud was to this message. And Truman continues, "I do not consider that my urging of the admittance of a considerable number of displaced Jews into Palestine or my statement with regard to the solution of the problem of Palestine in any sense represent an action hostile to the Arab people." So the situation was very tense during those years, and of course, after that also. Truman receives a report from the liberated camps in Europe in August 1945. And he reads the following: "As matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is led to wonder whether the German people seeing this are not supposing that we are following or at least condoning Nazi policy." At that time, there were about 300,000 Jews survived from Holocaust. This Mr. Harrison also made interviews. Thousands and thousands of poor Jews were interviewed, and this is a report from those questions. "With respect to possible places of resettlement for those who may be stateless or who do not wish to return to their homes, Palestine is definitely and preeminently the first choice. Many now have relatives there, while others, having experienced intolerance and persecution in their homelands for years, feel that only in Palestine they will be welcomed and find peace and quiet and be given an opportunity to live and work." One of Truman's challenges was the State Department. And actually he hired the great general, George Marshall, his Secretary of State, without knowing his stance on Palestine and the Jewish issue. And basically he found an opponent in the Oval Office, which really created quite interesting situations. I come to that in a minute. Basically, as you may remember on the first chart, there was a change of leadership in the Great Britain in 1945, almost simultaneously when Truman became president. So Prime Minister Churchill lost his office, and a new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, came instead. And many scholars, many researchers say that he was an anti-Semite. He closed the doors of Palestine. He ordered his troops to shoot the Jews that were entering the shores of Palestine. And Truman wanted to open the gates because he saw and he understood that all survivors wanted to get there, almost each of them. The UK government enters a crisis in the the beginning of 1947, they were not able to maintain peace in Palestine, and they throw the future of Palestine into the United Nations. United Nations take a step to create, as we already heard here, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine with 11 neutral countries. And these countries were supposed to research, study, interview people in Palestine, both sides, Jews and Arabs. Jews were eager to answer, tell their opinions. Arabs refused. And so basically they bring that report to the United Nations. When Truman got that report that was given from the United Nations in September 1947, so Truman understood that his lifelong vision about Israel and the Jewish people was about to come true. And that vision Harry Truman had received already in his youth. He tells in his memoirs, and I'm quoting it pretty much in my book, that by the age of 12 years, he had read the Bible twice. And he was very excited about the end-time prophecies that Jewish people would return into their ancient homeland in the end of the days. And now he understands that that momentum is in his hands. And he starts work on towards that goal. The problem was that the whole State Department, including Secretary of State, was against him. They wanted to have good terms with Saudi Arabia and oil, but Truman wanted to make a difference, and he worked hard to make this happen. I show you this the map of partition plan. You can see the Jewish state as green or blue, and Arab state orange. And in the middle of Arab state there is city of Jerusalem, internationally administered city. That was it was supposed to be corpus separatum. Jews accepted the proposal, Arabs didn't. But when it came to this day, 75 years ago, these were the countries that voted in favor of partition, and within these red box you can see countries that were against the formation of the Jewish state. And while I have studied and saw these countries, I have questioned myself, how are these countries doing today? And you may answer the same question. Afghanistan, India, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Yemen, Greece, Turkey, Egypt, and Cuba. I think they all were on the wrong side of the history. Finally, one of the closest advisors of President Truman, White House counsel Clark Clifford, wrote in his memoirs, his own reading of ancient history and the Bible made him a supporter of the idea of the Jewish homeland in Palestine, even when others who were sympathetic to the plight of the Jews were talking of sending them to places like Brazil. He didn't need to be convinced by Zionists. In fact, he had to work hard to avoid the appearance of yielding to Zionist pressure. I remember him talking once about the problems of displaced persons. Everyone else who's been dragged from his country has some place to go back to, he said, but Jews have no place to go. And the first United Nations Secretary General said the following: I think we can safely say that if there had been no Harry Truman, there would be no Israel today. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, dear friends, I want to thank the ambassadors for giving great and interesting speeches, even as Mr. Huvila, and we are also grateful to the Federation of Finland-Israel Association for co-organizing and co-hosting this event. 75 years after such a historical decision in United Nations is really a reason to commemorate. Finland has had long-standing friendship with Israel. If I remember correctly, we have had diplomatic relations now for over 72 years, and this sounds good. But today I'd like to give a strong message to my colleagues in this House, here in Finland, to parliamentarians in the European Union, representatives in United Nations, and to the entire world. But before I give the message, I'd like to quote what Golda Meir said. She said lots of things, usually good things, but this is a very important message even today. When peace comes, we will perhaps in time be able to forgive the Arabs for killing our sons. But it will be hard for us to forgive them for having forced us to kill their sons. Peace will come when the Arabs will love their children more than they hate us.